I'm going to share with you guys how to serve an N12 form in Ontario. My name's Daniel Hale, and I made this channel to help landlords in Ontario make better decisions. So if that's you, make sure you subscribe and stick around. Let's start by explaining what the N12 is. N12 is a 60-day notice that the landlord gives the tenant to end the tenancy. And you can give it to the tenant for these reasons. You're selling the property and the purchaser needs the property for their own personal use. You, the landlord, needs the property for their own personal use. Or maybe one of these people need the property for their own personal use. The landlord's child, the landlord's parents, the landlord's caregiver, or the landlord's spouse. It must fall into one of those categories, and then you have the right to serve the N12 notice. But it's also important to know when you cannot serve the N12 notice. If the person is an investor, you cannot serve the N12 notice. That person must assume the tenancy. If the tenant is on a fixed term lease, you cannot serve the N12 notice. They have the right to finish their lease term. You can serve it to them, however, if that tenant is on a month-to-month lease or if they are 60 days from finishing that fixed term. Now, most people ask me when they serve this notice, how long does it take to get vacant possession? Here's the truth. So just because you serve that notice doesn't mean they're gonna comply and they're actually going to leave. If the tenant feels it's unlawful, they're probably gonna stick around for that landlord and tenant board hearing. But the tenant has 60 days from the time that you serve that notice to them to vacate the property. But don't do this guaranteeing in your mind that they're gonna leave, because there's a chance they might not, and that's why you need to make sure you do all of these steps correctly. So let's talk about how to serve the notice. You're going to check off the boxes on that notice for the reason why you are serving it, whether it's for you, the purchaser, your parents, your child, whatever that reason is. You check off those boxes on the notice correctly. You make sure you fill out the notice correctly, which is super important, because if you don't and you get to the landlord and tenant board, they will throw it in the garbage. So your name needs to be correct, the tenant's name needs to be correct, the address needs to be correct, and it needs to be served correctly. How do you serve this to the tenant? You mail it to them, you can hand deliver it to them, and you can slide it underneath their door. My recommendation, strong recommendation, is to mail it to them. You'll have a certificate of service stating that you did this, and in Ontario, when you mail a notice to the tenant, it's automatically deemed delivered. So they cannot say to you, I didn't receive this notice. So that's the best way. And please do not post the notice on their door. This is not considered delivered. The tenant can also go to the hearing and say, I didn't get the notice, it must have blown off my door. Don't do that. It's not considered valid. Now let's talk about the timelines of when you deliver this notice. It must be given to the tenant from the time that they pay rent. And the termination date, which is the date that you are telling them they must leave by, is the last day of the following month. So for example, tenant pays rent on September 1st, I give them that notice, they have the 60 days, it's the end of that second month. So their termination date would be October 31st. You cannot give it to them on September 2nd and expect them to leave on October 31st. If you're past the rent period of the 1st, you have to wait for the following month. Now, the landlord and tenant board also requires you an extra 5 days if you are mailing it to them. Meaning, if you're serving it to the tenant for September 1st, you must mail it out 5 days beforehand. I recommend you do 6, give yourself 1 extra day for a grace period. But just make sure it's from the time the tenant pays rent. That's when you must serve it. And then you owe the tenant compensation for serving this notice. You owe them 1 month's rent, and that amount must be exact down to the penny. If you've given them a rent increase, make sure you know how much their lawful rent actually is, and you send them that amount. Now you also need proof that you sent them that amount. So I recommend you do e-transfer so that you can save it. If the tenant doesn't accept the funds, that's on them. You still sent it and you tried. And the money must be sent to the tenant before the termination date is done. If you do not send it, that notice becomes unlawful and you have to start all over again for any of those reasons. You don't send the money, it's filled out incorrectly, you don't serve it correctly. All of these things can put you in the back of the line again. And the truth is, from the time of this video, the landlord and tenant board is backed up about 4 to 5 months. So you don't want to start again. That sucks. Now you've done all of those things correctly. The next step is to file the L2 to the landlord and tenant board. A lot of people make this mistake. It drives me nuts. They don't file the L2 to the landlord and tenant board. If you don't do this, you're not going to get a hearing date. So if the tenant doesn't leave, he has nothing to worry about because there's no hearing anyways. The L2 is a form that you give to the landlord and tenant board. You fill that out, you notify them that you've served an N12, and they will give you a hearing date. So if the tenant starts giving you a hard time, closer to that 60-day termination date, you will get a landlord and tenant board hearing, which will make them act quicker. And if you're serving that N12 for the purpose of a sale, the buyer doesn't have a hearing, they're probably gonna sue you if the tenant doesn't leave and you can't extend or take them to a hearing and get them evicted. So you got a lot of trouble there. So make sure you file the L2, get yourself a hearing date, even if the tenant's complying and telling you they're gonna leave. Cover all your bases. Now, sounds crazy, but we're gonna now talk about the sheriff. I have actually seen this happen a few times from people on this channel. We've helped them with their N12, we've sold their property, we've done all of those things, and the tenant still doesn't leave, but we have the right to extend the agreement. We have enough time where we can actually get vacant possession, but we need the sheriff because the tenant actually is not complying and they're fighting it to the bitter end. And if that's the case, after the hearing of the landlord and tenant board, they will give you, if you do everything correctly and you prove that it is a lawful eviction, they will give the tenant an eviction date that they must leave by. If the tenant doesn't leave by that date, then you can apply to the sheriff, pay the sheriff, and he will come within about 6 to 8 weeks and evict that tenant. It's unfortunate, but sometimes you have to go that direction. And if you need any help with your N12 notice, selling your property, dealing with any of these scenarios, shoot me an email, send me a text, or give me a call, and don't forget to subscribe. I'll see you guys in the next video.